For 91 days the valley mocked the broken veteran digging a hole in cursed dirt. Then a historic drought hit, and his crazy well became their only salvation. The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental. They laughed when he dug. They laughed for 91 days straight. A broken veteran with a shovel, a limp, and a German shepherd named Smokey, working a patch of Montana dirt the whole valley had already written off as cursed. Jax Harlan lost his wife, his house, his money, his country's thanks. All he had left was 40 acres of cracked earth and the stubborn belief that there was water underneath it. Smokey never left his side, not once. Then the longest summer in 100 years came, and Sage Creek ran dry, and every well in the valley turned to dust. Every well except one. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The first pale light of another brutal April morning crept with slow, reluctant fingers across the flat, cracked, and sun-bleached earth of the old Harlan homestead, touching the bent sagebrush and the rusted barbed wire and the pale, dusty ribs of a 1997 Ford F-250 that had been parked in the exact same spot for 11 straight months. The air was thin and cold in the way that only high-country Montana air can be cold in late April, the kind of cold that did not bite hard but settled instead into the hollow places of a man's chest and refused to leave, soaking through canvas and wool and whatever fraying old military surplus he had pulled over himself during the night. Jax Harlan was already awake. He had been awake for a long time. He lay in the narrow fold-out military cot he had stretched across the truck bed under a faded green tarp, his boots still on, his hands folded across his chest the way they had been folded across his chest every morning for 15 years in barracks and tents and the backs of transports, and he stared up at the underside of the tarp and counted the slow rhythmic drips of condensation that had gathered along the seam during the night. He did not move. Not yet. Movement came later, in its own time. The way everything came to him now, slow and considered and cautious, because fast movement was a thing the body remembered for different reasons, and the body did not forget easily. Somewhere out beyond the tarp, in the flat blue dawn, a meadowlark that had survived the winter tried its brittle first song of the year. Jax closed his eyes. The sound was clean. The sound did not belong to anything broken. He let it run. Beside the truck, lying in the dirt with her belly flat against the cold ground and her amber eyes already open and already reading the perimeter, Smokey waited. She had not slept fully either. She never slept fully. Her thick double coat was dusted with the pale powder of the valley, giving her black and tan markings a ghostly, veteran look as though she had been made from the land itself. Her ears turned once, softly, toward the meadowlark, and then turned back toward the truck where Jax was breathing, measuring the cadence, confirming. When he finally sat up, the tarp crackled softly with frost, and she rose in the same motion, without sound, without fuss, her nose lifting once to read the wind that was already stirring the sagebrush. She did not wag her tail. She did not need to. There was a language between them that had been written in foreign places, in the back of transports, in the long silent hours in field hospitals, in the trembling minutes after loud things, and that language did not require a tale. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with disuse, because he had not spoken in 2 days. She blinked once at him. Acknowledgement. He stepped down out of the truck bed, his left knee catching the way it always caught, and he stood for a long moment in the thin blue dawn and looked out across 40 acres of the only thing he still owned in the entire world, 40 acres of cracked, pale, dry-as-bone Montana sagebrush flat. A collapsed stone foundation where a cabin had stood once before he was born, before his father was born. A foundation that had belonged to a man named Elias Harlan, who had walked this ground in 1934 with a mule and a boy and a dream. A rusted windmill with half its blades missing. A twisted line of posts where a fence had once run. And in the middle of all of it, a hole. A deep, narrow, hand-dug hole, shoulders wide at the mouth, going down into the earth at an angle a drilling crew would have laughed at, surrounded by a careful pile of dirt and stone that grew a little taller every single day. His well. 91 days he had been digging it, 91 days of shovel and pickaxe and hand auger and a small gasoline pump he ran for 30 minutes at a time to clear the accumulated groundwater. 91 days of calloused palms and split knuckles and the slow grinding ache of a back that had taken more than one kind of blast wave. He walked to the edge of the hole and looked down. The wooden plank he had placed across the mouth was coated with morning frost. Down in the dim shaft, the small patch of dark earth at the bottom glistened with the faintest sheen of seepage. Not enough. Not nearly enough, but enough to keep going. Behind him, Smokey took up her morning position. She did not need to be told. She settled herself on the high ground 12 feet east of the well, where the sightline ran all the way to the gravel county road half a mile away, and she laid her head on her paws, and her eyes, those endlessly steady amber eyes, began their quiet sweep of the horizon. Left, center, right, back. She did this every morning. She would do it until he told her otherwise, and he would not tell her otherwise, because he was not going to insult a soldier by telling her to stand down on her own watch. Jax walked to the truck and opened the passenger door and leaned inside. A beat-up metal coffee percolator sat on the floorboard, a small propane camp stove, a half-empty bag of the cheap black grounds he had bought at the gas station 2 weeks ago. He lit the stove with a match, and the soft blue hiss of the propane was another sound the body had learned to trust, because it was the sound of a small contained fire a man controlled, and there were very few things in this world a man could still control. While the coffee began to speak in its low metallic voice, he reached under the passenger seat and pulled out a small rectangular tin. It had once held tobacco. The lid was dented from a fall in a Humvee in a country he did not say out loud. He opened it on the seat and looked inside. There were 3 things in the tin: a photograph, a folded letter, a single small gold ring. The photograph was of a woman with dark hair, laughing at a camera on a beach that did not exist anymore in his head. A woman whose name he still said in his sleep sometimes and then hated himself for saying. The letter was from an attorney in Billings, with a firm date 10 months old and a series of numbered paragraphs that had, in cold and precise and completely legal language, transferred the house and the savings account and the 2 vehicles and the small savings bond his mother had left him to the woman in the photograph. The ring was the ring she had thrown at his chest in an airport parking lot the last time he had seen her, after which he had driven away in the car he had paid for, and he had stood in the parking lot in his uniform and watched the taillights go, and Smokey, beside him, had not moved, had not made a sound, had simply pressed the length of her body against his leg and held it there until he could walk again. He closed the tin. He put it back under the seat. That was the whole history. 3 objects. The coffee hissed a warning, and he poured it into a tin mug and walked back toward the well with the mug in one hand and the cold air in his lungs, and he sat down on an overturned 5-gallon bucket and watched the sun begin to lift itself over the long eastern ridge of the valley, throwing the first pale gold across the sagebrush. Smokey came and sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder rested against his thigh. She did not look at him. She was still watching the road. Down on the county blacktop, a red diesel truck with oversized tires and dual stacks had slowed to a crawl. It was the same truck. It was the same truck every morning. Marvin Callahan, 58 years old, 2 ranches to the south. A man whose father had sold the middle parcel of the old Harlan place in 1971 and who behaved as though that sale had personally ennobled his bloodline. The truck crawled. The window came down. A pale, meaty arm came out and made a gesture that was meant to be clear and meant to be humiliating, and then the truck roared off in a cloud of diesel black. Jax did not look up. He sipped his coffee. Smokey did not move. Her ears had marked the sound and dismissed it. This was the morning. This was every morning. He was not a stupid man. He knew what they said about him in the valley. He knew what they said at the feed store and at the little diner on Route 12 and at the Sunday service none of them thought he would ever walk into. They said the Harlan place was cursed. They said a broken soldier had come back from somewhere and had squatted on 40 acres of worthless dirt and had started digging a hole to nowhere, like some kind of man who had forgotten what century it was. They said the dog was dangerous. They said the man probably was too. They said it was a matter of time before the county came out and cleaned the whole mess up. He knew what they said. He did not care. He had not come back to this ground to be loved by it. He had come back to this ground because it was the last piece of earth in the entire world that had ever belonged to a man whose blood he shared. And because when he had woken up one morning in a VA hospital in Spokane with a diagnosis he had not consented to and a wife who had already sold everything, he had known, in the simple animal way a man knows things, that if he did not find one piece of ground in the world that was his, he was not going to last the year. So he had cashed the small disability check. He had driven south across the border into Montana. He had walked into the county tax office, and he had bought, parcel by parcel over 8 months, 40 of the original 240 acres. His grandfather Elias had homesteaded in 1934 under the Second Homestead Act. The rest of the original place had been sold off in pieces decades ago by a father he barely remembered. He was not going to get the rest back, but he was going to get the heart of it, the piece with the cabin foundation, the piece with the windmill, the piece his grandfather had stood on. In a photograph Jax had seen exactly once as a small boy, with a mule and a boy and a hand on a shovel. A shovel. He finished the coffee. He set the mug on the ground. Smokey adjusted her head slightly to the north, where something small and four-legged was moving in the brush, and her ears tracked it for a moment, and then released it. Not a threat, a rabbit. Let it live. Jack stood. He rolled his shoulders once. He walked to the well and pulled the wooden plank aside and looked down into the dim shaft and breathed in the cold earth smell of deep ground, which was one of the smells his body trusted without reservation. He picked up the shovel. Far off, somewhere up the valley, another diesel engine started up. It was going to be a long day. It was going to be another long day in a long string of long days. And at the end of it he was going to sit on an overturned bucket and drink a second cup of cheap coffee, and Smokey was going to put her head on his knee, and he was going to listen to the meadowlark try its brittle song once more before full dark. That was the life. That was the whole of the life. And the country that had sent him overseas and come back to nothing, the country whose flag he still kept folded tight in a footlocker under the cot, the country that had written him 3 letters of commendation and then forgotten his name. That country was not going to see him again until he decided it would. He stepped into the hole. He raised the shovel. He began to dig. Smokey settled onto her paws. Her amber eyes resumed their sweep. Left, center, right, back. The wind shifted out of the north that afternoon, the way it sometimes shifted in late April in the high country, pulling a thin sheet of fast white cloud across a sky that had been, all morning, the hard clean blue of a ceramic plate. The temperature dropped 4 or 5 degrees in the space of an hour. The meadowlark went quiet. The pale dust that had been rising in slow, lazy spirals above the well fell back to the earth and stayed there. Jax, up to his waist in the shaft, felt the change in the light before he felt it in the air. His head came up, his shoulders stilled. Out of old and unshakable habit he performed the small internal inventory a soldier performs when the weather changes in a place he is working, and he confirmed what he already knew. No storm coming, just wind. Just the valley breathing the way the valley breathed. He set the shovel against the wall of the shaft and climbed up the wooden ladder he had built himself out of 2x4s, one rung at a time, sparing the left knee. When his boots hit flat ground at the top, Smokey was already standing. Her head was turned toward the gravel road. Her tail hung still. Not alarm, attention. A vehicle was coming. Slow, older. The engine had the low rattle of a small diesel that had seen a lot of miles. Not Marvin's truck. Not any truck Jax had heard on this road before. He wiped his hands on the thighs of his canvas pants. He did not reach for anything. He simply stood, one boot forward of the other. His body angled a quarter turn away from the road the way his body stood in all new situations, presenting less of itself to whatever was coming, and he watched. The vehicle that came around the bend was a tan 1988 Ford Bronco with a rust spot on the passenger door the size of a dinner plate. It slowed at the broken wooden post that marked the entrance to his property. It turned. It rolled carefully down the rutted dirt track toward the foundation stones and the well and the truck, and it came to a slow, respectful stop about 40 feet away, and the engine shut off. The driver's door opened first. An older woman stepped out. She was small and weathered and straight-backed, with silver hair pulled into a low, simple bun at the nape of her neck. She wore a pale blue cotton work shirt, faded jeans, and a pair of pull-on ranch boots that had been resoled twice. Her hands, when they came into view, were calloused in the deep and permanent way, hands calloused only by decades of actual work could be. She was perhaps 67 years old. She moved with the slow, deliberate care of a body that had arthritis and had made peace with it. The passenger door opened next. A young traveler stepped down. He was thin and serious, a silent observer of the world, with his grandmother's straight posture and a shock of pale brown hair that stood up in the back where he had slept on it. He wore a rugged canvas coat and jeans that had seen better days, cuffed heavily at the hem. He did not speak. He shut the door behind himself and stood very still beside the truck and watched Smokey with the steady, serious attention of a child who had been raised to be careful around animals bigger than himself. The woman carried something in both hands. It was a covered ceramic dish wrapped in a clean blue kitchen towel. She held it in front of her the way a person holds an offering, which is a different way from how a person holds a gift. Smokey did not growl. Her ears were forward but soft. Her amber eyes were on the woman's hands, then on the boy, then back. She was reading them the way she read every human who came onto the property, and Jax, who had learned over many years to trust her read entirely, waited. After a long moment, Smokey's tail moved, once, a single slow, soft sweep through the dirt behind her. Acknowledgement, permission. Jax let out a breath he had not been aware of holding. "Mr. Harlan," the woman said. Her voice was low and steady and unhurried. "My name is Eleanor Thorne. Most folks call me Ellie Mae. I live on the old Thorne place, 3 miles west of here, on the county road. This is my grandson Caleb." Jax did not answer immediately. He nodded once. That was enough of an answer for the moment. "I brought you a pie," she said, holding out the dish slightly. "Apple, from the jars we put up last fall. I know it is an imposition. I apologize for the imposition." Jax looked at the pie dish, then at the woman, then at the boy, then at the Bronco. He did not know what to do with any of this. In 91 days, one human being had set foot on this property voluntarily. And that had been the UPS driver with a package of well casing, and the driver had thrown the package over the fence and driven off fast. "Ma'am," Jax said. His voice came out rougher than he had intended. He cleared his throat. He tried again. "That is kind of you. You did not need to do that." "I know," Ellie Mae said simply. "That is the nature of the thing." She took a half step forward, slowly, and set the pie dish on the tailgate of the F-250, which was the nearest flat surface. She stepped back. She did not push. Caleb had not moved from beside the Bronco. His eyes were still on Smokey. Ellie Mae saw this. She spoke to her grandson without looking at him. "Caleb, you stay right there until Mr. Harlan tells you what the rules are." "Yes, ma'am," the boy said. It was the first and only word he had spoken. Jax looked at the boy. He looked at the dog. He thought for a long, slow beat. "She will not hurt him," Jax said, "as long as he moves slow and does not run at her." "Did you hear that, Caleb?" Ellie Mae said, still without turning. "Yes, Nan." The boy did not move. He understood that hearing the rule was not the same as being given permission. Jax noted this. He noted it the way a soldier notes any useful piece of intelligence about a new person. "Come here, son," Jax said. The boy came, walking slow, his small hands visible at his sides. Smokey watched him come. When the boy was perhaps 5 feet away, she lowered her head and released the tension in her shoulders in a deliberate, visible way, and the boy, without being told, stopped and held out one small hand, palm down, knuckles forward, the way a child raised around dogs is taught to do. Smokey stretched her nose forward and touched his knuckles with the cool, damp tip of her muzzle. Then she sat down. Then her tail moved again, twice, slow. The boy's face did something small and quiet. He did not smile, but something in his face settled. "Her name is Smokey," Jax said. "Yes, sir," the boy said. Jax looked at Ellie Mae. She was watching the whole transaction with the still, clear eyes of a woman who missed nothing. When her gaze came back to his, he understood without any words at all that she had come here for a reason that had nothing to do with a pie. "You came to tell me something," Jax said. Ellie Mae nodded once. "I did." She was quiet for a moment. She looked out across the 40 acres, across the cracked sagebrush flats, across the low line of the distant ridge to the east. There was something in her face, some recognition, some long, quiet grief that Jax could not read. "Not yet. My husband Harold died 11 years ago this June," she said. "He was a Marine. Vietnam. 3 tours. Came home the way. A lot of them came home. He did not speak of it. He worked. He built the place. He raised our son. He did not sleep well for the last 40 years of his life. You understand what I am saying, Mr. Harlan? Yes, ma'am, Jack said quietly. My son, Caleb's father, he followed his daddy into the service. He did not come home at all. He is buried in a town in Afghanistan I could not point to on a map, though God knows I have tried. Jax did not speak. There was nothing to say to that. He simply lowered his eyes for a slow breath, the way a man lowers his eyes in a room where a flag has just been folded, and then raised them again. Ellie Mae nodded once, a small acknowledgement of his acknowledgement. Then she said, quieter, I did not come here today to lay my griefs on your fence line. Mr. Harlan, I came because 3 days ago the county clerk's office sent a registered letter to my mailbox by mistake. It was addressed to this property. It was meant for you. I drove into town yesterday to return it. They gave me the correct address. They also told me, because it is a small county and people talk what is in the envelope. She reached into the breast pocket of her cotton shirt and pulled out a folded white envelope. She held it out. Jax took it. He did not open it. He looked at the return address in the upper left corner, Sage County Board of Supervisors, Department of Land and Water Resources. What does it say? He asked. His voice was flat. He already knew. Men who had received enough official letters in their lives knew the weight of the paper before they knew the content. It says, Ellie Mae answered that under Montana statute, land held for non-agricultural purposes in designated agricultural zones is subject to review for productive use. It says you have 60 days to demonstrate productive use of this parcel. It says that if you cannot demonstrate productive use within 60 days, the county will initiate proceedings to place the parcel into forced auction for non-payment of the agricultural assessment fee. Jax was quiet for a long time. A thin cold wind moved across the sagebrush somewhere up the valley. A crow called twice and went silent. They are going to take it, he said. He was not asking. They are going to try. 60 days. 60 days. Jax looked down at the envelope in his hand. Then he looked for a long and quiet moment at the well, at the careful pile of dirt and stone beside it, at the wooden plank he had laid across its mouth, at the ladder he had built out of scavenged 2x4s. 91 days of his life were inside that hole. 91 days was not 60. 91 days and he was still not to water, not real water, not sustaining water, not the old cold water his grandfather had told him was down there. He felt for one quiet second the old particular weight arrive in his chest, the weight that was not grief exactly, but was grief's older cousin, the weight of a man who has been shown one more time that the structures of the country he served do not bend for him and never will. Smoky, without being called, moved. She crossed the 3 feet of dirt between them and pressed the full length of her body against his leg and leaned. It was a specific and deliberate lean, firm and solid, the lean she used when she had decided a man needed a wall. Jax did not look down. He did not need to. He put his hand on the top of her head and left it there. After a moment, he said, very quietly, to Ellie Mae, why did you bring me this? Because they were not going to bring it to you themselves, she said. They were going to leave it in a mailbox you do not have, and then claim you failed to respond. I have seen this county do it before to men like you. I did not come here to save you, Mr. Harlan. I came here because my husband would have come, and my husband is not here to come, so I came in his place. Jax looked at her. He saw for the first time who she was. Not a neighbor making a delivery, a widow of a soldier keeping a promise no one had asked her to keep. He swallowed. He nodded once. Thank you, ma'am. You are welcome, Mr. Harlan. There was a long silence. The wind moved again. Caleb was still standing near Smokey, one small hand resting on the heavy fur of her back, completely still. The way a child stands when he has been given a gift he is not sure he is allowed to have. Ellie Mae looked at the well. She looked at it for a long time. You are digging by hand, she said. Yes, ma'am. My husband said once, when I asked him why a neighbor was doing something the hard way, that some things a man has to do with his hands, because if he does not do them with his hands they are not his. She paused. He learned that from somebody. He would not say who, but he said it often. Jax did not answer. His throat had closed for reasons he could not quite explain. Ellie Mae nodded once more, as if something had been settled in her mind that she had come here to settle. Then she turned and put her hand on her grandson's shoulder. Caleb, time to go. Yes, Nan. The boy looked at Smokey once more. He took his hand off her back slowly. Smokey did not follow him. She sat, amber eyes steady, and watched him walk back to the Bronco. Ellie Mae looked at Jax. "The pie dish is yours to return whenever you're in town. There is no rush." "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Harlan." "Yes, ma'am." "I hope you find your water." Jax nodded. He did not trust his voice. The Bronco started up. It turned. It rolled back down the rutted track. It reached the gravel road, turned west, and went small in the distance, and then it was gone, and the only sound in the whole flat valley was the thin, cold wind moving through the sagebrush and, somewhere far above, the single dry call of a circling hawk. Jack stood with the envelope in one hand and Smokey's head under the other. He did not open the envelope. He already knew what it said. 60 days. He looked at the well. He looked at the horizon. He set the envelope on the tailgate beside the pie dish. He walked back to the edge of the shaft. He picked up the shovel. Smokey resumed her watch, and Jax Harlan, 41 years old, veteran of 3 deployments and 1 catastrophic homecoming, grandson of a man named Elias, stepped back down into the hole his grandfather had told him about when he was a boy. And he kept digging. The town of Sage Creek, Montana, sat at the bottom of the valley, where the creek that had given it its name made a slow, lazy bend around a stand of old cottonwoods and ran south toward the Yellowstone. It was not a large town, 380 residents on the census, a feed store, a hardware store, a diner, a volunteer fire department, a Lutheran church, a small square brick county building where the clerk and the sheriff and the assessor all shared a hallway and a single coffee pot. Along Main Street the buildings leaned a little, the way buildings in small valley towns learn to lean after enough winters, and the storefront signs were painted by hand and had been painted by hand since before Jax was born. Jax drove into town on a Tuesday morning the week after Ellie Mae's visit, because Tuesday was the day the county clerk's office was open for walk-in service, and because a man with 60 days on a clock does not waste his Tuesdays. He had not been into town in 6 weeks. The last time had been for feed and fuel. He had kept his head down then. He planned to keep his head down now. Smokey rode in the passenger seat of the F-250, upright, alert, her amber eyes reading the road, the way she read every road, her breath fogging the inside of the windshield in small rhythmic blooms. She was wearing her old red working harness, the one with the faded patches on the sides, because in a civilian town the harness did more than any human word Jax could have spoken. It announced her. It said to whoever glanced into the cab that this was not a pet, this was working machinery. Leave her alone. He parked across the street from the feed store, because he needed a roll of heavy-gauge fencing wire, and the hardware store did not carry that weight. He rolled the driver's window halfway down. He looked at Smokey. "Stay," he said. Her ears flicked once. She settled her chin on the edge of the seat. Her eyes stayed on him through the window as he crossed the street. The feed store was a long, low building of corrugated metal and wooden beams that smelled, the way all feed stores in small western towns smelled, of molasses and grain dust, and old sacking and the faint sweet chemical smell of tack leather. A bell above the door rang when he pushed it open. 3 men were standing at the counter. They all turned. 2 of them he did not know. Ranch hands, probably. Young, weathered, tired. The third was Marvin Callahan. Marvin was leaning one meaty elbow on the countertop, a can of chewing tobacco open in his other hand, and when his eyes came up and found Jack standing just inside the door, something came into his face that was not quite a smile. It was the expression a man puts on when he has been handed, unexpectedly, an opportunity he has been rehearsing for. "Well," Marvin said, loud enough for the whole store to hear, "look what the dry wind finally blew in." Jax did not answer. He walked past the counter and down the center aisle toward the back wall, where the fencing wire was stacked in heavy spools on the concrete floor. He could hear Marvin behind him. "Hey, Bobby, you see this? The digger has come to town. Must be taking a break from his hole." One of the ranch hands laughed. The other one shifted uncomfortably and looked at his boots. Bobby, the clerk, was a thin 23-year-old in a camo ball cap behind the register. He was the owner's nephew. He was not a cruel kid, only a young one in a room with a loud adult, and he gave a small wincing laugh that he did not seem to want to give. "How deep you down to now, soldier?" Marvin called. 30 feet 40. You gonna hit China soon, or you gonna hit bedrock first? I got $50 on bedrock. Any takers? Jax picked up a 50-pound spool of fencing wire. He did not answer. He walked it back up the aisle toward the counter. He did not look at Marvin. He set the spool on the counter in front of Bobby. $28, Bobby said, his voice quieter than it had been when Jax had come in. Jax pulled a fold of bills out of his jacket pocket, counted them out, laid them on the counter. $30. He waited for the two back. "I'll tell you what, soldier," Marvin said louder now. "I feel sorry for the dog. I really do. Must be a hell of a thing to be an animal tied to a man who lost his house and is now losing his mind digging a hole in the dirt. That dog deserves a better life than that." Jax's jaw tightened. He did not move. He did not turn. He kept his eyes on the counter and on Bobby's young, nervous hands counting the change. Something in him, the thing that had been a staff sergeant for 8 years, the thing that had learned under fire how to measure exactly when to speak and when to hold, held. It held hard. It held the way a man holds his own wrist to keep his hand from moving. Bobby laid $2 bills on the counter. Jax picked them up, and that was when the pickup truck in the street outside backfired. It was a loud, sharp, double-crack percussive sound, the sound of a badly tuned engine with carbon in the cylinders, the exact pitch and rhythm of an AK report at close range. And Jax's body did what Jax's body did before his mind got there. His shoulder dropped, his left hand came up. His knees bent 4 inches, his weight shifted to the balls of his feet. His eyes, which had been on the counter, swept the room in a single fast involuntary arc and found the exits, the cover positions, the hands of every other man in the store, all of it, in under half a second. He caught himself at the end of that half second. He stopped. He did not move again. He breathed out once, slow, through his nose. Marvin had seen. Marvin's eyes lit up with the small, bright pleasure of a man who has just been handed something he did not know he was going to get. "Whoa, boy," Marvin said, and he laughed, a short, barking laugh. "Easy there. Nobody's shooting at you. You're in Montana." The two ranch hands shifted. One of them did not laugh at all. The other laughed once, and then seemed to regret it. Jax picked up the spool of wire. His hand, he noticed with a small, cold, clinical part of his own mind, was steady. He did not look at Marvin. He did not answer. He walked out of the feed store. The bell rang behind him. In the street the air was thin and cold and clean. A pale high cloud was moving east over the ridge. Across the street he could see Smokey through the windshield of the F-250, and her body was already halfway up off the seat, her shoulders square, her amber eyes fixed on the feed store door, and when he crossed the street and opened the door and climbed in, she did not relax until his hand was on her shoulder. He sat for a moment with his hand there. Her breathing was even. His was not. He counted, silently. The way he had been taught to count in a room in Walter Reed by a woman with a clipboard and kind eyes. 4 in, 7 hold, 8 out, 4 in, 7 hold, 8 out. On the 3rd cycle his pulse slowed. On the 4th, it was back where it belonged. He put the truck in gear and drove 2 blocks east and parked in front of the small square brick county building. He sat for a moment. Then he opened the door. "Stay," he told Smokey again. The county clerk's office was a single linoleum-floored room with 2 desks, a faded framed map of Montana on one wall, and the low, quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. A heavy-set woman in her early 40s sat behind the larger desk. The brass nameplate read Mrs. Patterson. She looked up when he came in, and he saw clearly, in the brief involuntary flick of her eyes, that she knew exactly who he was and had been expecting him. "Mr. Harlan," she said. "Ma'am." He took off his cap. He held it in both hands in front of himself. He stood the way a soldier stands in a superior's office, because the country had taught him to stand that way in rooms like this one, even when the person behind the desk was not a superior of anything except her own paperwork. "I received a letter," he said. 60-day notice on my land. I came to understand my options." Mrs. Patterson's face softened a degree. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman with a ledger and a mortgage and a job. "Please, Mr. Harlan, have a seat." He sat. He laid the cap on his knee. "The statute," Mrs. Patterson said, opening a folder, "requires that agricultural zoned land demonstrate productive agricultural use on an annual cycle, a functioning water source, evidence of cultivation or grazing, some form of documented output. The previous owner of your parcel let the land lapse for 14 years before selling to you. You inherited the lapse. The board is choosing now, this year, to enforce." "I understand. Do you have a functioning water source, Mr. Harlan?" "Not yet." "Do you have cultivation? Grazing, output?" "Not yet, ma'am." Mrs. Patterson sighed. It was a small, genuine sigh. I am required to tell you that without any of those things, at the 60-day review, the board will be required to vote to initiate auction proceedings. I do not write the statute. I am only telling you what it says. Yes, ma'am. Is there an avenue of appeal? There is. You may file a declaration of ongoing improvement. It requires written documentation of active work toward productive use, witnessed by a notary and signed by 2 Valley residents in good standing. It buys you an additional 30 days, 90 total. Jax did the math in his head. 90 days from today, late July. Where do I get the form, he said. Mrs. Patterson looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out a single-page carbon form and slid it across the desk. Fill it out, she said. Bring it back with the signatures. I will notarize it myself. Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Harlan. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry about the letter. I truly am. He looked at her. He saw, in her face, that she meant it. He nodded once. Not your fault, ma'am. He stood. He put his cap back on. He folded the form into his jacket pocket. He walked out. The hardware store was 2 blocks further down Main, set on a corner, with wide front windows and an old wooden plank floor that creaked under his boots when he stepped inside. The bell above this door was softer than the feed stores. The smell was different: sawdust, fresh paint, copper wire, machine oil. An older man behind the counter looked up, nodded, and went back to whatever he was writing. Jax walked to the back of the store where the digging tools were kept, and there, standing in front of the hand augers, was Ellie Mae Thorne. She had a metal-banded auger in her hands. She was turning it slowly, examining the soundness of the shaft. Caleb was with her, holding her grocery bag, silent and serious as before. She looked up when he approached. Her face registered him without surprise. Mr. Harlan. Ma'am. That one you have is worn, she said, nodding at his old rusted auger she had seen at the property. This one is heavier gauge, American-made. Harold bought one for the old post hole work 30 years ago, and I will tell you for nothing it outlasted him. Jax looked at the auger in her hands. It was a good tool. $42 on the price tag. He had not planned to spend $42 today. I cannot afford it today, ma'am. I know you cannot, she said without looking at him. Which is why I am buying it. You will owe me 1 good day of labor on my south fence line in September when my foreman's shoulder goes, which it will. That is the deal. Take it or leave it. He looked at her. He looked at the tool. He looked at the boy, Caleb, who was watching the whole transaction with the flat, serious attention of a child who understood that adults were doing an adult thing and that he was not to interrupt. Ma'am, that is a generous offer. I will take it, and I will work that day. I know you will, she said. They walked to the counter together. She paid for the auger. The older man behind the counter looked from Ellie Mae to Jax and made no comment and simply rang it up. Outside on the sidewalk, she handed Jax the tool. Mr. Harlan. One more thing. Yes, ma'am. The declaration of ongoing improvement for your 90-day extension. It requires 2 signatures from residents in good standing. I am one. I do not know who your second is going to be. But you come see me the night you have your first signature. I will not sign alone. A thing like that is stronger with 2 names on the same day. He looked at her. He had not yet said out loud that he had heard of the extension. She had known he would learn of it. She had known he would go to the clerk. She had been 10 moves ahead of him the whole week. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. Caleb, standing beside his grandmother, looked up at Jax. Sir, the boy said. It was the second word he had spoken in Jax's presence, and it was offered with the grave attention of a child who had decided this particular man deserved a title. Jax looked down at him. Something in his chest moved a 1/4 inch that had not moved in a long time. Yes, son. Is Smokey in the truck? She is. Can I say hello to her? Jax glanced at Ellie Mae. She nodded. Once. Come on, son, Jax said. They walked back to the F-250 together, the 3 of them, and Smokey saw the boy through the glass, and her tail moved once against the seat, and when Jax opened the passenger door, she did not jump down because she did not have permission, but she lowered her head and allowed the boy's small, careful hand to rest for a long moment on the thick fur behind her ear. The boy did not speak, neither did the dog. Whatever was passing between them was not a thing for speaking. Jax stood beside the truck with the auger in his hand and watched the boy touch his dog, and he understood in a quiet way that the cost of what the county was doing to him had just become concrete in a way it had not been concrete an hour ago. Because if he lost this land, he was going to lose it in front of this child, and the child was going to remember the losing. After a moment, Ellie Mae put her hand gently on her grandson's shoulder. Time, Caleb. Yes, Nan. They walked to the Bronco. They got in. They drove away. Jack stood on the sidewalk for a long moment with the auger in his hand and Smokey's breath fogging the window beside him. He was 41 years old. He had 90 days. He got in the truck. He laid the auger on the floorboard. He put his hand on Smokey's head and left it there for a slow count of 10. Then he turned the key. He drove home. Summer arrived in Sage Creek Valley 3.5 weeks early that year, and it arrived not as a season, but as a verdict. The long, cold spring that had held the valley in a kind of gray, suspended animation through April and early May broke one evening the second week of May with a single dry thunderstorm that produced no rain, only a long, low rumbling that rolled across the ridges for 40 minutes and left behind a smell of ozone and scorched sagebrush and nothing else. The next morning, the temperature climbed to 89 degrees before noon. By the end of the week, it had hit 96. By the middle of the third week in May, the thermometer nailed to the post outside the diner on Main Street read 103 at 1 in the afternoon, and a retired schoolteacher sitting in the window booth remarked to no one in particular that she had lived in this valley since 1961 and had never seen anything like it. On the old Harlan place, at the bottom of the shaft, Jack's had now dug down to 29.5 feet. The air was cooler than it was on the surface by about 8 degrees. But it was a heavy, motionless, dead-feeling cool that pressed against the lungs the way cool air at the bottom of a mine pressed against lungs, and it smelled of damp stone and wet clay and the particular mineral smell of earth that had not seen sunlight in 10,000 years. That smell Jax had noticed across the last 100 days was one of the very few smells in the world that did not send any signal of any kind to the parts of his brain that sent signals. It was a neutral smell, a clean, empty smell. He had come to love it in a way he would not have been able to explain out loud. On the first morning it hit 106 degrees at the surface. He went down into the shaft at 5 in the morning, before the light, and he did not come up again until 11, because the rule he had set for himself was that you worked the cool hours and you sat through the hot hours and you did not bargain with the sun. He came up at 11 that morning, with his shirt soaked through and his hands blistered and his beard white with stone dust, and he climbed the wooden ladder one rung at a time. And when his boots hit the flat ground at the top, he stood for a moment in the hammering brightness of the high noon sun, and he felt, for the first time in his life, the heavy particular stupor that only true heat produces in a body that is already depleted. His vision narrowed at the edges. The ground seemed to tilt 1/4 of a degree. He put his hand on the wooden plank to steady himself. Smokey was beside him in an instant. She did not bark. She did not nose at him. She did what she had learned to do in a very different country, in a very different kind of heat, and for very different reasons. She leaned the full weight of her shoulder against his left thigh, and she held it there, firm and solid, like a wall, until his feet remembered where the ground was. "I'm all right," he said. She did not move. "I'm all right, soldier. Stand down." She did not move. He put his hand on her head. He left it there. After a moment the ground stopped tilting. He walked slowly to the truck, and he drank warm water out of a gallon jug until the jug was half empty. And then he poured a small bowl of it for Smokey, who drank it in 4 clean laps and sat down again beside his boot. He sat on the overturned bucket. He closed his eyes for a long moment. The sun came through his eyelids as a red flat pressure. He opened his eyes. He looked down at the well. 29.5 feet. 34 was where his grandfather had said, in a kitchen in 1989, when Jax was 6 years old, his grandfather Elias, then in the last summer of his life, had lifted him onto a kitchen chair and put a glass of cold well water into his hands and said, "Listen, boy, this water came from 34 feet down. There's a story in that. You remember the number?" He had remembered the number. He had remembered it all his life. He had remembered it through high school and basic training and 3 deployments and a marriage and a divorce and a hospital room in Spokane. And he remembered it now, and he was 4.5 feet short, and the county's 90-day clock was down to 51. He stood up. He walked to the well. He picked up the shovel. He went back down. The second day at 106, the thing happened. He had been in the shaft for perhaps 2 hours, working in a slow, steady rhythm he had learned from his grandfather, by watching his father, who had learned from his grandfather, the rhythm of lift and swing and bite and pry, lift and swing and bite and pry, when the blade of the shovel struck, with full force, a flat buried stone the size of a car's hood that had been lying concealed 2 inches under the clay. The shovel blade rang. It rang at a specific pitch and with a specific ringing metallic overtone that Jax's body had learned in a very particular place on a very particular afternoon to associate with one thing and only one thing. And his body did what his body did. He was no longer in the shaft. He was in a culvert on a dirt road outside a town whose name he had been ordered never to speak in public. And it was 119 degrees, and the smell of diesel and human sweat and hot copper was in his nose, and the ringing of the shovel blade had not stopped, was still ringing, and somewhere close to his left, a voice he had loved was saying his name, in a tone that did not belong to any living man. He did not drop the shovel. He could not drop the shovel. His hand had locked on the shaft. His breath came in short, fast, shallow pulls. His knees went. He did not go down. He caught himself against the clay wall of the shaft, and he stood there with his forehead against the cool, wet earth, and his hand locked on the shovel, and his lungs refusing to fill, refusing to empty. Caught at the top of an inhale that would not move. Above him, at the mouth of the well, Smokey had risen. She did not bark. Smokey had never barked in an emergency in her entire working life. What Smokey did, what Smokey had been trained to do in a life before this one and had kept doing after everything else in her life had ended, was she came down the ladder. She came down the ladder. A 90-pound German shepherd with a bad left hip from a wound she had taken outside Fallujah in 2011 came down a wooden homemade ladder 1 rung at a time in the dim cool air of a hand-dug shaft. Carefully, deliberately, her claws finding the wood, her good rear leg taking the weight, her front paws placed with the controlled military grace of an animal that had come down a great many difficult surfaces in her career, and when her paws hit the dirt floor of the shaft, she walked across the narrow space and she pressed the full long length of her body against Jax's legs, and she held. Her body was warm. Her breath, coming in steady, even rhythms against his calf, was warm. He felt her before he saw her. He felt her weight. He felt the specific weight of her. Her weight was not the weight of the culvert. Her weight was the weight of 30 seconds ago. Her weight was the weight of a dog that had bled on the same foreign soil and had come home with him and had slept under a tarp for 11 months and had been here, 5 seconds ago. The weight dragged him, slowly, back to the shaft, his lungs unlocked. The inhale came. It came broken, and shallow, and ugly, and it came. Then an exhale, then another inhale. He slid his back down the cool clay wall of the shaft until he was sitting on the floor with his knees up and his forehead on his knees and his hand finally uncurling from the shaft of the shovel. Smokey lay down across his boots. She laid her head on his shin. Her amber eyes watched his face. He did not cry. He did not make a sound. His shoulders shook. Once, for perhaps a minute, in the small, tight, jagged way of a man's shoulders shaking, when a man has not cried in 7 years and is not going to start, and then they were still. He did not know how long he sat there. 10 minutes, 30. The cool, dead air of the shaft held him. Smokey's breathing was even somewhere above, far above, a hawk called once and was gone. When he could stand, he stood, slowly, one hand on the clay wall. He looked down at her. "All right," he said. His voice was rough. She did not move. Her amber eyes held his. "I hear you, soldier." He went up the ladder first, slowly, then he called her name once, softly, and she came up after him, one deliberate rung at a time, and when she reached the top, he was waiting with his hand out to take her weight under her chest, and he lifted her the last foot to the surface, and she stood on the flat ground and shook the stone dust from her coat in a long rippling wave, and the sun hit her coat and made the black fur look wet and the tan fur glow like old bronze. He walked to the truck. He sat on the tailgate. He pulled his canvas ruck out from behind the seat, and he set it on the truck bed beside him, and he unzipped it, and he started putting things into it. His shaving kit, a spare pair of socks, the tin box with the 3 objects, the folded flag from the footlocker. The small framed photograph of his grandfather and a mule and a boy. He sat there in the hammering noon heat, and he put the whole of his life, what was left of it, into a canvas ruck. Because a man who has had what just happened to him in a hole in the ground on a piece of land no one in the world wants him to keep, has reached the kind of moment where the honest thing to do is drive. He zipped the ruck, he slid down off the tailgate, he walked around to the driver's side of the truck, and he opened the door, and he tossed the ruck onto the passenger seat. "Smokey, load up." She did not move. "Smokey, truck, let's go." She did not move. She stood in the dust, 12 feet from the open truck door, amber eyes on him, ears forward, tail still, and she did not move. Her whole body was saying something very quiet and very clear. "Smokey," he said. His voice cracked. "Get in the damn truck." She did not move. He stood there. The sun beat on the top of his head. His bad knee throbbed. The ruck sat on the seat behind him. Slowly, slowly, she turned away from him, and she walked with the heavy measured gait of a soldier walking an old patrol route. Back across the flat dry ground toward the well. She walked past the well. She walked up to the small pile of dirt and stone he had built over 98 days. She turned around. She sat down beside the pile. She looked at him. The message was not ambiguous. Jax Harlan stood beside the open door of the F-250 for a long time. He did not know how long. Long enough that a thin column of dust kicked up on the county road far to the east and subsided again. Long enough that a cloud moved across the sun and off. Long enough that he felt in his legs the particular specific weight of his grandfather's hand on his 6-year-old shoulder in a kitchen in 1989. "Listen, boy, there's a story in that. You remember the number?" He remembered the number. He reached into the truck. He pulled the ruck out. He set it on the ground in the dirt. He closed the door. He walked across the flat ground to the well. Smokey rose as he came. Her tail moved once, then twice acknowledgement. He stood beside her. He looked down into the shaft. 29.5 feet. 4.5 feet to go. "All right, girl," he said. "All right." He went down the ladder. He picked up the shovel. He dug. For 3 more days he dug. He dug in the cool hours, and he sat in the hot hours, and he drank warm water from the jug, and he ate crackers from a foil sleeve, and he slept 3 hours a night on the cot under the tarp. His hands bled through the gloves, and he taped them, and they bled through the tape, and he taped them again. The blisters on his palms broke and reformed and broke again. His beard grew longer, his eyes sank deeper. Smokey watched from the high ground at the mouth of the shaft. Smokey did not move. On the 4th day, at 10 in the morning, at 34 feet and 2 inches below the surface of the flat, pale Montana earth of the old Harlan homestead, the blade of the shovel went through a thin band of wet gray clay and into something that was not earth. Water came up around his boots. Cold water, clean water. He stood in it for a long moment. It was up to his ankles. It was rising. He could feel it rising. He did not speak. He did not cheer. He reached down with his cupped hand, and he brought up a handful of the clear, cold water, and he held it for a long moment in the dim light at the bottom of the shaft, and then he put it to his mouth, and he drank. It tasted of stone. It tasted of deep earth. It tasted. And he recognized this with a sudden violent clarity that went through him like a shock. It tasted exactly the way the water in a glass in a kitchen chair in 1989 had tasted. His grandfather's water. He stood at the bottom of the shaft, with the cold water rising around his ankles, and he put his hand against the clay wall, and he lowered his head for a very long time. And he did not cry, and he did not cheer, and he did not name what was happening in his chest. Because there were things in this world that a man did not name, and this was one of them. Above him, at the mouth of the well, Smokey's amber eyes looked down into the dim, and she saw what had happened, and her tail moved, slowly, 3 times, against the pale dry earth of Montana. The water held through the last week of May and the first week of June, as the thermometer on the post outside the diner climbed past 107 and then 109, and then on a Thursday that people in the valley would remember for the rest of their lives, 112 degrees at 2 in the afternoon. Jax Harlan's hand-dug well kept filling, kept holding, kept producing clear cold water that rose in the shaft at a steady rate of about 14 inches an hour and held a level of 11 feet. He had lined the bottom 6 feet with stone he had hauled in from the old cabin foundation, and he had fitted a simple cast-iron hand pump over the mouth of the shaft, salvaged from an estate sale in Livingston, and bolted down onto a concrete pad he had poured himself. On the first morning, the pump drew clean water all the way to the spout. He stood beside it with the long curved iron handle in his hand, and he worked it, slowly, up and down, and the cold clear water came out of the spout and fell into a galvanized steel bucket, and he watched it fall. And he did not smile, because he had not smiled in 13 months. But something in the corner of his mouth moved about 1/8 of an inch, and Smokey saw it, and Smokey's tail made a single, long, soft sweep through the dust behind her. He filed the declaration of ongoing improvement with Mrs. Patterson at the county clerk's office on the first Tuesday in June. Ellie Mae Thorne's name was the first signature. An old rancher named Walt Denhart, who had known Jax's grandfather in the 1960s and who had heard, through the local network of elderly ranchers who knew things the young ranchers did not, that the Harlan grandson was back on the place, drove out in the dust one afternoon unannounced, looked at the well, looked at Jax, looked at Smokey and said only, "Boy, pencil," and signed his name as the second. 90 days became 120. The clock reset. Jax kept working. Meanwhile, above the valley, something bigger than Jax Harlan was happening. Sage Creek itself, the thin, clear stream that had given the town its name and had fed, for 140 years, every well and cistern and stock tank in the valley, was going dry. It had run at half its usual flow through May. It ran at a quarter by the first week of June. By the middle of June, the long, slow pools under the cottonwoods downtown held nothing but wet stones and a few silver fish gasping in shrinking puddles. By the third week of June, the creek bed was a white, dusty track of bare rock from the Upper Springs to the Yellowstone confluence, and the town children who had grown up swimming in the pools under the cottonwoods every summer of their lives walked along the dry bed in the evenings and picked up the smooth, pale stones and did not understand what they were looking at. The shallow wells went first. The Barlows, who ran sheep on the North Ridge, lost their well on June 19th. The Crenshaws, east side of town, lost theirs on June 21st. By the end of the month, 11 households in the valley were hauling water in plastic barrels from a single deep municipal well behind the firehouse. And the mayor had gone on the county radio asking residents to voluntarily limit showers to 3 minutes and to stop watering lawns entirely. By the second week of July, the municipal well itself was running at 1/3 capacity. By the third week, a state emergency had been declared across 4 eastern Montana counties, and the tanker trucks the state was supposed to send were 2 weeks behind schedule, and the valley was quietly beginning to understand. In the way small western valleys understand things when they understand them, that help was not coming as fast as help was needed. On the morning of July 24th, Jax Harlan stepped out of the truck bed at 4:30 before dawn, as he had stepped out every morning for 187 mornings, and he walked to the well, and he pumped a bucket of water for Smokey, and a bucket for himself. And he stood in the cold, blue pre-dawn air and watched the thin line of false dawn creep up over the eastern ridge, and he did not know, because there was no way he could know that at that exact moment, 3 miles west on the old Thorne place, the single functioning well on Ellie Mae Thorne's ranch had just sucked dry at the bottom of its shaft, and Ellie Mae was standing in her kitchen with her hand on her grandson Caleb's forehead, and Caleb had thrown up twice already that morning, and his skin was hot and dry, and she was realizing, with the cold clarity of a woman who had nursed a husband through a great many things, that he was in the first stages of heat sickness, and that the jug of water on her counter held the last half-gallon in the house. At 8:15 that morning, a convoy arrived at Jax Harlan's gate. There were 9 vehicles, 3 pickup trucks, 2 SUVs, a flatbed with 2 steel water tanks lashed to the deck, and 3 sedans. Between them, perhaps 22 people. Men mostly, some women. One small figure in the back of the lead Bronco, pale and slumped against the door. Marvin Callahan's red diesel was out front. They stopped at the broken wooden post that marked the entrance. The lead truck's door opened. Marvin stepped out. He was not in a good mood. He was not dressed in his loud mood. He was dressed in the sweat-darkened work clothes of a man who had not slept and had been in his barn at 3 in the morning trying to coax a dying calf back from the edge of dehydration and had lost. "Harlan," he called, across the 40 feet of dirt. His voice was hoarse. "Harlan, I want to talk." Jax was standing beside the well. He had heard the convoy coming from a mile away, and he had stood up, and he had set the pump handle down, and he had waited. Smokey was beside him. Her ears were forward, her tail was down. Her amber eyes were already reading the vehicles, the doors, the hands, the faces, counting. "Mr. Callahan," Jack said. His voice was flat and even. "You got water?" "I do. The whole valley is out." "I know it." Marvin's jaw worked. He was a man who had spent 8 months leaning out of a truck window, making a specific hand gesture at another man's dignity. And he was now standing in that other man's dust, asking for something, and he did not have the vocabulary for the moment, and it showed on his face. "We are prepared to pay," he said. "We brought the tanks. We brought cash." Behind him, a door opened. Then another. People were getting out of the vehicles, 12, 15, 18 of them. They came up the rutted track behind Marvin in a loose, tired, uncertain group, and they stopped in a rough half-circle perhaps 30 feet from Jack's. And they stood there in the hot, flat morning sun and looked at him with the particular expression of people who have come to ask for something from a man they have spent months telling themselves they were better than. Jax did not answer Marvin. He was watching the crowd. So was Smokey. At the back of the crowd, half hidden behind the shoulder of a tall rancher named Del Bryson, stood Ellie Mae Thorne. Her face was drawn. Her mouth was a thin line. She was holding her grandson Caleb upright against her hip with both of her arms, and Caleb's head was lolling against her shoulder, and his small face was pale with that specific gray-white paleness of a child whose body had begun to shut down non-essential circulation. Jax saw her. Ellie Mae saw him see her. She gave him a look that was not a plea and was not an apology. Only a look that said, "I did not know this was what they were doing when they rolled past my drive. I would not have come. I came anyway, because of him." Jax looked at Caleb. Smokey had already seen. The dog's amber eyes had been moving across the crowd with the slow, sweeping method she used for threat assessment, and they had stopped on Caleb, and they had stayed on Caleb. And they had read Caleb the way only a working dog with 36 months of combat medic field experience and a retired handler's sixth sense could read Caleb. And what she read was not in the argument, and not in the threat, and not in the money Marvin was offering. What she read was the one human body in that entire half-circle that was, in that moment, actively dying. "Harlan," Marvin was saying, louder now. "Harlan, I'm talking to you. Name your price, per gallon, whatever you want. We got 11 households on the north side that are dry, and my own stock is 3 days from losing the older cows, and by God I did not drive out here to beg." "Then do not beg," Jack said. Marvin's face flushed. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," Jack said, still watching the crowd, "that a man does not have to beg for water in Montana." There was a low, angry ripple in the crowd. Someone behind Marvin said something that was not quite a word. Someone else said, "Just let us pay, for God's sake." A tall man with a sunburned neck took a step forward and stopped. Smokey began to move. She did not growl. She did not bare her teeth. She did not posture. She moved the way a trained working dog moves when a handler has become inessential to the decision, and she moved at a slow, deliberate walk directly forward into the half-circle of people, her amber eyes locked on a single point, and the crowd, which had been angry and had been loud and had been closing the distance a foot at a time, stopped. Every single person in that crowd stopped. She walked between them. She walked past Marvin Callahan, who did not move, who did not speak, whose hand was frozen halfway up to a gesture he had been in the middle of making. She walked past Del Bryson. She walked past 3 women in cotton dresses standing with folded arms. She walked in a straight, quiet line, the full 30 feet of that rough half-circle, and she did not look at any of them, did not acknowledge any of them, did not flick an ear at any of them, because none of them were her mission. She stopped in front of Ellie Mae Thorne. She lowered her head. She sat down in the dirt directly at Caleb Thorne's feet. Then she laid her heavy head, very gently, on the top of the boy's small dusty boot, and her amber eyes came up, slow and clear and endlessly steady, and they found Jax's face across the 20 feet of silent dirt, and they held. The whole crowd understood at once. Nobody in that crowd had to be told what Smokey was doing. The message she was sending had not been coded in any language a human could get wrong. She had walked past every adult in the half-circle, and she had knelt at the feet of the one body in the circle that could not be saved by argument. She had put her head on his boot. She had looked at her handler. Ellie Mae's breath caught in her throat. It was a small, involuntary, terrible sound. and it broke something in the silence. Jax was moving before he knew he was moving. He crossed the 20 feet of dirt at a fast, even walk. He did not speak. He unslung the canvas water canteen from his belt, the one he had filled from the well at dawn, and he held it out, and Ellie Mae took it with one hand while still holding Caleb up with the other. And she unscrewed the cap with her teeth, and she put the mouth of the canteen to the boy's lips. "Caleb, drink, baby, slow, small sips." The boy drank. Water ran down his chin. He coughed. He drank again. His eyes opened a quarter of an inch. He looked up at his grandmother. "Nan," he whispered, "I'm sorry I threw up in the truck. Hush, baby. Hush." Smokey had not moved. Her head was still on his boot. Her amber eyes were still on Jax. Jax turned. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Marvin Callahan. He looked at the 17 other human beings who had come here that morning, ready to buy what the world had told them they were entitled to buy, and who had just all of them at once watched a 90-pound German shepherd explain to them, without a single sound, that the thing they had come here to buy was not a commodity and had never been a commodity, and that there was a child in their own half-circle that they had driven past and had not seen. Nobody spoke. Jax looked down at his canteen in Ellie Mae's hand. He looked at the boy. He looked back at the crowd. "Form a line," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not have to be loud. "Children first, elders second, everyone else in the order you arrived. My pump works at 4 gallons a minute. I will run it for as long as the shaft holds, which I expect to be the rest of the summer. You will take what you need for drinking and cooking. You will not water your lawns with my water, and you will not wash your trucks with my water. If I see anybody hauling extra, I will cut the line off at the spigot. Are we clear?" Nobody answered. "Are we clear?" A chorus of low, hoarse yeses came back. "I will take no money." There was a long, startled silence. "Harlan," Marvin said thickly. "Harlan, now listen. I will take no money, Marvin. I did not dig this well for money. I dug it for water. The water is here. Water is not a thing a man in Montana charges his neighbors for. Form the line." They formed the line. They formed it slowly, awkwardly. The children came first, and parents pushed them gently to the front. And Ellie Mae carried Caleb to the very front. And Jax himself worked the pump handle for that first bucket. Slow and even, and the cold, clean water came out of the spout into a galvanized pail. And he handed the pail to Ellie Mae. And Smokey sat beside the pail, and Caleb, already coming back to himself, put his small hand on her head. Then the next child. Then the next. For the next 7 hours, Jax Harlan worked the pump handle, and Ellie Mae Thorne poured, and Smokey watched the line, and the valley came through the broken wooden post at the end of the rutted track, one bucket at a time. Men who had 3 weeks earlier leaned out of truck windows to mock him now stood bareheaded in the sun and waited their turn. The tall man with the sunburned neck apologized in a low voice without looking at Jax's face. A woman Jax had never met put a hand on his forearm for 2 full seconds and did not speak and walked away. Marvin Callahan stood at the back of the line the entire time and waited for his water last, which was his own decision, and when his turn came he took 1 bucket and said only, "Much obliged, Harlan," and got into his truck and drove home. Ellie Mae stayed. Caleb stayed. Del Bryson, the tall rancher, stayed. Walt Denhart arrived around noon with 2 of his grandsons and a flatbed of firewood as a trade Jax had not asked for and was not allowed to refuse. Somebody brought sandwiches from the diner at 1 in the afternoon. Somebody else brought a 5-gallon jug of iced tea. By the end of the first day, the line had moved through the whole west side of the valley, and a rough schedule for the next day had been worked out on the back of an envelope. When the sun finally went down behind the ridge that evening, and the last truck had pulled away in a cloud of pale dust, and the hand pump was ticking softly in the cooling air, Jax sat on the overturned bucket by the well, and Ellie Mae sat on a stump he had dragged over for her. And Caleb sat on the ground in front of Smokey, with his back against her warm ribs and her heavy head resting on his shoulder. And for a long time none of them spoke. "Mr. Harlan," Caleb said finally. "Yes, son. Smokey has a scar on her shoulder. I felt it." Jax looked at the boy. He looked at the dog. He looked at the darkening eastern ridge. "She does," he said quietly. "How did she get it?" Jax was quiet for a long moment. Ellie Mae did not prompt him. She simply waited. "She took a piece of metal," Jax said, "in a place that did not have a name I am allowed to say. She took it because it was coming for a friend of mine. She did not know the friend was my friend, she only knew the metal was coming, so she went first. Did your friend live? He did not, son. The boy put his small hand on Smokey's shoulder, over the long, pale ridge of the scar under her fur. Does it still hurt her? Sometimes, when it gets cold. Then I will always rub it for her when it gets cold, Caleb said, if I am there. Smokey's tail made a single long, soft sweep through the dust behind her. Jax did not answer the boy. He could not. His throat had closed in a way it had not closed in front of another human being in more than a decade. He looked out across the darkening sagebrush flats of the old Harlan homestead, and he saw the first hard stars of the Montana night coming out one by one above the eastern ridge, and he felt for the first time since a woman with dark hair had laughed at a camera on a beach that no longer existed, something loosen a quarter-inch in the center of his chest. Ellie Mae saw it. She did not say anything. She simply got up, slowly, and walked over and put one weathered hand on his shoulder for a moment, and then walked back to her seat on the stump. Above them the stars came out. The pump ticked softly. Caleb fell asleep against Smokey's ribs, and somewhere out in the dry valley, for the first time in 2 long months, a coyote called, clean and sharp, to the rising quarter moon. Ellie Mae Thorne came back alone 3 days later, in the long gold light of a late afternoon in the first week of August, in the Bronco, without Caleb in the passenger seat. She came up the rutted track slowly, parked beside the F-250, and stepped down holding a small cardboard banker's box pressed against her hip with one arm. The box was old. The cardboard was yellowed. The lid was held down with a single wide band of faded blue masking tape that had at some point in the distant past had writing on it which had since rubbed away. Jax was at the pump, greasing the iron handle with a rag. The well had held through the worst of July, had held through the panicked 10 days of the first community line, had kept holding as the state tanker trucks finally arrived and partially relieved the pressure, had kept holding as a second well, which the volunteer fire department had drilled with a rented rig on the municipal lot using directions Walt Denhart had given them based on Jax's read of the aquifer, had come in at 41 feet with passable water the week before. The valley was not out of the woods. The valley was standing at the edge of the woods, but they were standing. He set down the rag when he saw Ellie Mae coming. Smokey rose from her spot by the wooden plank and walked with the slight stiffness that came in her bad hip after a long afternoon, out to meet the Bronco the way she now met all Bronco arrivals, which was with a single gentle sweep of her tail at the door. "Ma'am, Mr. Harlan." She did not get out any other words. She stood with the banker's box against her hip and looked at him, and her face had something in it Jax had not seen before. A kind of long old grief that had been worked through and polished smooth over years and was being held up now, carefully, for a specific purpose. "Come inside," Jax said. He had built in the last 3 weeks, with the help of Walt Denhart's 2 grandsons and a pile of salvaged lumber, a small wood-frame lean-to shelter against the south wall of the old cabin foundation. It had a plank floor and a plank roof and a single plank door on leather hinges. It was not a house, it was a shelter. It was the first structure any Harlan had put on the place in 41 years. He had been sleeping in it for 4 nights. He led her inside. He pulled the single wooden crate he used as a chair out from the wall, and he set it beside the low folding table he had scavenged from a church rummage sale, and she sat, and she set the banker's box on the table, and she laid both her hands flat on top of it for a long quiet moment before she spoke. "My husband Harold," she said, "kept a box, one box. He kept it on the top shelf of our bedroom closet, and in 49 years of marriage he did not, one time, take it down while I was in the house. I knew it was there. He knew I knew it was there. We did not speak of it." Jax sat down on an overturned bucket across from her. He did not speak. Smokey lay down across the threshold of the door, her head on her paws, her amber eyes half closed, her ears tracking. "After he died," Ellie Mae went on, "I left the box where it was. For 11 years I left it. I told myself I would open it when I was ready, and I was never ready, so I never opened it. Then, Caleb's father, my son, was killed in 2019, and I thought, all right, it is time. And I went up to the closet one afternoon in the fall, and I took the box down, and I carried it to the kitchen table, and I sat down in front of it, and I found that I still was not ready, so I put it back on the shelf, and I left it there." She paused. Her hands on the lid of the box were very still. "After the day you opened your gate, Mr. Harlan. After Smokey, after the line, after that child on your dog's shoulder. That night I went home, and I put Caleb to bed, and I climbed up on a kitchen chair, and I took the box down, and I opened it." She lifted the lid. There was not much inside. A stack of envelopes with military postage marks, tied together with string, a small Marine Corps unit patch with a broken corner, a folded piece of paper that might have been a discharge record, a handful of loose photographs, black and white, their white borders yellowed with age. And on top of the photographs, a single-color snapshot with a pale blue ballpoint pen date scrawled across the bottom in a man's handwriting. Ellie Mae took the top snapshot out. She turned it over, she laid it in front of Jax on the folding table. Jax looked down. The photograph showed two men standing on a piece of flat, pale Montana sagebrush land, in front of a partially built cabin of unpainted wood. It was summer. The sky was hard blue. One of the men, on the left, was young, maybe 25, with a Marine Corps high and tight, and the loose build of a man who had not yet grown into his chest. His right hand rested on the shoulder of the man beside him, and he was laughing in that open, easy way only young men laugh. The other man was older. 40, perhaps 45, broad-shouldered, weathered, dark beard, dark eyes, a hand on the handle of a shovel that was propped, blade down, in the loose dirt at his feet. He was not laughing. He was looking with a kind of deep, steady affection at the younger man beside him. The handwritten date across the bottom in pale blue ink read, Sage Creek, summer 1962. Jax's hand went still on the table. The older man in the photograph was his grandfather, Elias. He had seen exactly two photographs of his grandfather in his life. One was a small framed image on his mother's dresser during his childhood. The other he carried in his ruck, the one with the mule and the boy. He had never seen this one. He looked at the younger man. He looked at the Marine Corps high and tight. He looked at the handwriting on the bottom, and the handwriting matched a handful of old Christmas cards Ellie Mae's husband had sent his mother over the years, cards Jax had read as a child and had not understood. "That is my husband, Harold," Ellie Mae said quietly. Home between his first and second tour, he came up to Montana for 6 weeks, the summer of 1962. His father had died the spring before, and Harold had nowhere else to go, and your grandfather Elias Harlan, who had known Harold's father in the Pacific in 1944, and had kept loose contact with the family ever since, wrote to Harold and told him there was a cabin half-built on a piece of land in Sage Creek Valley, and if Harold wanted to come help finish it, Elias would feed him and teach him things his own father had not lived long enough to teach him. Jax did not speak. His hand on the table had curled in on itself. Harold went. He stayed the full 6 weeks. When he came home, he told me, the woman he was engaged to at the time, which was me, that he had met the finest man he had ever known in Montana. He said Elias Harlan had taught him how to read the land, how to find wind shelter, how to work a shovel, how to sit quietly after dark with a dog and not need to speak. He said Elias told him, one afternoon over a hand-dug well they were working on together, that there was water under the sagebrush that the river did not know about. Stubborn water, old water, deep water, and that any man who could read the signs of it and had the patience to dig for it and did not insult the land by using a machine, he said, could live on it for as long as he lived, and so could his sons, and so could their sons. And if the whole river ever went away, the land would still feed a family. She paused. Harold quoted those words to me 300 times in our marriage, Mr. Harlan. He quoted them to our son when our son was a boy. Our son quoted them to Caleb before he deployed the last time. And 3 weeks ago, Mr. Harlan, I stood in that half-circle of people at your gate, and I watched you say, I did not dig this well for money. I dug it for water. Water is not a thing a man in Montana charges his neighbors for, and I understood, standing there, who your grandfather was. Jax's eyes were on the photograph. He could not lift them. Something old and heavy was unfolding slowly inside his chest. He had not known. He had not known any of this. He had come back to this piece of ground because his 6-year-old self had been told in a kitchen in 1989 that there was a story in the water at 34 feet. He had not known his grandfather had trained another man on this ground. He had not known the sentence his grandfather had spoken over a well in 1962 had traveled, through one Marine's honor, through a son's deployment, through a grandmother's kitchen, through 11 years of a widow's grief, across 63 years and 4 generations, to arrive back on its own home ground in his own mouth on the morning he opened his gate. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was not steady. "I know," Ellie Mae said. "I did not know any of this." "I know that too." She lifted another photograph out of the box. She laid it beside the first. In this one, the young Marine Herald stood alone beside the partially built cabin, and the cabin was recognizable, unmistakably, as the cabin whose stone foundation Jax now walked past every morning on his way to the well. "Your grandfather's cabin," Ellie Mae said. "Yes, ma'am. My husband helped finish it." "Yes, ma'am. This is not a stranger's land, Mr. Harlan. You are not a stranger on it. You came home." Jax sat for a long moment without moving. Smokey's amber eyes from the doorway were on him. She had not moved, but her breathing had shifted very slightly into the slow, steady rhythm she used when she had decided the room did not need her intervention. After a long while, Ellie Mae cleared her throat. "Mr. Harlan, there is something else." He lifted his eyes. "After the day at your gate, certain people in this valley began to talk quietly, amongst themselves. I was not a part of these conversations because I had not been to a Grange meeting in 4 years and I was not invited. But Walt Denhart was, and Del Bryson was, and eventually Marvin Callahan was, and Marvin Callahan, Mr. Harlan, went to the last 3 Grange meetings and did more talking than he has done in a decade." Jax's brow furrowed. "Last Tuesday," Ellie Mae said, "the Grange voted unanimously to petition the Sage County Board of Supervisors to restore to you, by deed of transfer, the 60-acre parcel immediately east of your current property line. That parcel was part of your grandfather's original 160-acre homestead claim filed in 1934. It was seized by the county in 1958 for a water diversion project that the county never built, and has sat in public trust unused for 67 years. The Grange's position is that the project never happened. The purpose was never served, and the land should be returned to the family from which it was taken." She placed a single sheet of paper on the table beside the photographs. It was a petition. It had, Jax could see at a glance, more signatures on it than he could immediately count. The first signature, in heavy black pen at the very top of the page, was Marvin Callahan's. Jax looked at it for a long moment. "He signed first," he said. "He asked to sign first," Ellie Mae said. "He drove out to my place on Sunday night. He sat on my porch for 2 hours without speaking. Then he said, 'Ellie Mae, I owe that man a debt I do not know how to pay, and I would like it if I could sign the paper first.' He drove to every house in the valley personally with the petition on a clipboard on his passenger seat. He did not miss one. He told each of them the same thing. He said, 'I was wrong about him. I was wrong about all of it.' And then he asked them to sign." Jax did not speak. He could not. "The board meets on the 12th, Ellie Mae said. "They will need you to appear in person. They will need documentation of your grandfather's original claim. Walt Denhart has told me he has paperwork in his own family records, because his grandfather was your grandfather's witness on the original 1934 filing. He is bringing it." She closed the banker's box. She slid the 2 photographs across the table toward Jax. "These are yours now. Ma'am, I cannot take your husband's photographs." "Yes, Mr. Harlan. You can. My husband would have walked you to the truck and put them in your hands himself, and if I did less than that for his sake, he would haunt my kitchen. Take them." Jax took them. His hand closed carefully around the 2 small pieces of photographic paper. He held them for a moment. Then he laid them face up on the folding table beside the petition. He stood up. He walked slowly past Smokey, out of the shelter, across the flat, dry evening ground, to the well. He stood beside the hand pump. He looked out, for a long time, across the 60 acres of unused public land to the east. The sagebrush ran to the base of the ridge. The light was gold. A red-tailed hawk was working the thermals above the ridgeline in slow, patient circles. Smokey came up beside him. She sat down at his boot. She did not speak. She did not need to. He did not move for a very long time. Then very quietly, he said to the dog, to the valley, to a grandfather who had been dead for 37 years, a single word: home. Smokey's tail made one slow sweep through the dust. On the 12th of August, Jax Harlan walked into the Sage County Board of Supervisors meeting in the small, square brick county building on Main Street, with his beard trimmed and his military surplus jacket brushed clean of dust and his combat boots polished. Ellie Mae Thorne walked in beside him. Walt Denhart walked in behind him carrying a brown accordion folder of 1934 homestead documents. Del Bryson and Marvin Callahan walked in after Walt. The room was full. Standing room only. Every seat was taken. People had driven in from the upper valley. People had driven in from the lower valley. The mayor was there. Mrs. Patterson, the clerk, was there, sitting in her normal seat with her notary stamp ready. Caleb was there, in the second row with his grandmother's sweater around his shoulders, watching Jax with the serious, quiet attention of a boy who was witnessing something he would remember for the rest of his life. The board chair called the meeting to order. The motion was read. The petition was presented. The 1934 homestead documents were entered into the record. An objection was raised by a younger board member who cited a procedural irregularity in the chain of title. The objection was technically valid. It would require, under the strict reading of the statute, a 6-month continuance. The room murmured. The board chair looked uncertain. Jax, who until that moment had been sitting quietly in the front row with his cap on his knee, stood up. He walked to the small wooden podium. He adjusted the microphone. He looked at the board. He looked at the room. He spoke. "My name is Jax Harlan," he said. "My grandfather was Elias Harlan. He filed on this land in 1934. He built a cabin on this land in the summer of 1962 with the help of a young Marine named Harold Thorne. He taught that Marine to read the water in this valley, and that Marine taught his son, and that son taught his son. And 3 weeks ago, when a child of that line went down in the dirt at my gate, my dog walked past every adult in the crowd and put her head on that boy's boot. The water we drank that day came from 34 feet under the ground. My grandfather homesteaded. The procedural irregularity you are concerned about, sir, is a paperwork lapse from a 1958 county project that was never built and never will be built. With respect, I am not asking this board for anything that was not already mine. I am asking this board to acknowledge the ground my grandfather walked on. Thank you." He stepped back from the podium. The room was completely silent. The board chair looked at the younger board member. The younger board member looked at the table. Mrs. Patterson, the clerk, very quietly laid her hand flat on the stack of 1934 documents and looked at the board chair and gave a small nod. The board voted 4-1. The 60 acres east of Jax Harlan's property line, seized in 1958 for a project that had never been built, was restored by unanimous petition of Sage County residents in good standing and confirmed by a majority vote of the Board of Supervisors to the Harlan family in perpetuity. The room broke into a sound that was not applause exactly. It was something deeper than applause. It was the low, rolling sound of a small valley community making, in public and on the record, a correction. Jax walked out of that meeting with 100 acres in his name. In the parking lot, Marvin Callahan was waiting beside his red diesel truck. He was holding his hat in both hands. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Harlan, I have been an ass." "You have?" Jax said. "I would like to haul you that load of lumber I owe you. For the barn." "I did not know I was getting a barn." "You are," Marvin said. "The Grange voted on it Tuesday. Labor is volunteer. Lumber is from me. You do not get a vote, Harlan. It is happening." Jax looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 13 months and 4 days, the corner of his mouth moved, half an inch. Maybe less. "Obliged, Marvin. Obliged my ass, Harlan. Shake my hand." Jax shook his hand. Smokey, sitting on the asphalt at his boot, made one slow sweep of her tail, and then another, and then laid her head down on Jax's polished combat boot and closed her amber eyes in the warm August sun. Late October came slow and cold to Sage Creek Valley, the first hard frost silvering the sagebrush at dawn, the cottonwoods along the dry creek bed turning a brittle gold. Jax Harlan knelt in the cool morning shadow of the stone wall he had been building, for 6 weeks, in a low circle around the mouth of the well. The wall was waist-high now. Caleb Thorne, bundled in a too large chore coat, handed him each stone in turn, serious and careful, the way a boy hands a tool to a man he has decided to stand beside. Jax lifted the final stone, a flat slab of pale quarry granite. He had carved into its face with a chisel and a hammer and 7 evenings of patient work. 4 simple lines. Harlan, 1934. Ilias walked here. Water is not for sale. He set the stone into place. He tamped the mortar. He stepped back. Ellie Mae, on the porch of the new small cabin he and Marvin and Walt's grandsons had raised against the old foundation, set down her coffee cup and did not speak. Smoky gray, now at the muzzle, moved stiffly across the cold ground, and she laid her heavy head, one last time that morning, against the top of Jax's worn combat boot. He did not look down. He did not need to. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.